Hello, everybody. All right, welcome to the Mikestand. Today is Monday, May the 12th, 2025. Hopefully, everybody had a good weekend this past weekend, as we now getting back into the first for the week here. Of course, we're going to give people a chance to come in before we get started. So hopefully, if you haven't already, you guys can help out by liking and sharing the stream. See if we can get some more friendly people to engage. That'd be appreciated. Also, if anything here grabs your attention, feel free to comment and or ask questions. I'll try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. As I said, we're just waiting for people to show up here to give people a chance to come in before we get started. Let's see. Well, quite a bit was going on, even though AEW didn't have its collision this past week, and a number of organizations were, including Stardom, a lot of them over in Japan, having some big events. Up in Canada, they had Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling had its event, of course. WWE had its Backlash as well. So, let's see now. Anyways, let me put the music on while yeah. And I'm back, so hopefully now things will start to pop up a bit here. All right, so we're just waiting, give people. So we're up to the 3 minute mark now. So I guess I'll talk about what's on tap tonight. So I've got a couple articles to go over tonight from Bleeding Fool. Let me just try one more. I'm here to spark some interest. As we will. All right, so let's see. So yeah, all right. Alrighty then. So with that, let's So tonight, as I said, I got a couple articles I'm going to go over here, from including a former collaborator of Neil Gaiman comments on Neil's recent scandals, and also we're going to get another little profile piece, the opinion piece on whether or not DC Comics truly needed Crisis on Infinite Earths to fix its continuity. Of course, both articles are by our old buddy Avi Green, who, as everybody knows, has got quite a few opinions on things. So, looking at his reasoning and all that, that's what we do here regularly. We go over his articles. Plus, of course, I got the wrestling wrap up, in which, of course, we'll look back over the weekend's WWE News says, we'll look back to Friday Night SmackDown as well as look to look to also look back on Backlash. Some stuff happened at Backlash, and then also look ahead to tonight's Monday Night Raw, and then of course we'll wrap things up with this day in each history. So with all that being said, why don't we go ahead and get started then? Let me go ahead and, of course, bring about the material that we will be talking about tonight. Alrighty then. So here we go. As many of you know, we've been kind of following the Neil Gaiman situations. He's come under fire in the last few months over some pretty damning accusations, where a number of women have basically accused him of some pretty nasty stuff. So now what we're going to look at here is one of the people he's collaborated with now commenting on the situation. So former collaborator Dave McKean comments on Neil Gaiman's scandals. Article by Avi Green, published May 11th, which of course was yesterday. So let's get into this. So artist Dave McKean, who worked with the disgraced Neil Gaiman from the late 1980s to the late 2000s, was interviewed by Logica. And here's what he has to say in response to Gaiman's sexual assault scandal, translated from Italian. Interviewed by Logica during Comic-Con Napoli 2025, British cartoonist and illustrator Dave McKean commented on, now this is from the article, of course the first part was from Avi, commented on the harassment allegations against his longtime collaborator, Neil Gaiman. The story emerged in July 2024 when a journalistic podcast reported the testimonies of several women. Quote, I've never had a problem separating the art from the artist, but I say that because a lot of the art I like is old, and so maybe it's easier to separate someone like Wagner from his music, because we're talking about an artist who lived 200 years ago. It's probably less easy to do that with a contemporary artist, unquote, McKean said. Quote, the other thing is that our collaboration goes back a long time. You know, I drew those works 20 or 30 years ago, so they seem very distant to me. I don't even look at the stuff I did last year, so I certainly don't look at the stuff I did 30 years ago, so it doesn't really affect me, unquote. Quote, the thing that does affect me about this whole sad story is that, I haven't spoken to Neil in 10 years. We were good friends for a while, and I thought I knew him well, unquote, the artist continued. Quote, maybe he's changed over the years, or maybe I didn't really know him. That really upset me. I think you can imagine if you have a friend you think you know well, and something even related to his past changes the perception you had of him. It is shocking and destabilizing. I have never spoken about it in public because I never talk about anything on social media. And then I knew him when he was still with his first wife. I never met Amanda Palmer. I don't know the truth. I'm waiting for a court to decide, unquote. which I think is a very neutral approach to take, right? Unfortunately, Dave McKean, in that regard, I think is somebody who is relatively in the minority there. You know, unlike certain others out there who've already decided that, even though a court of law has not decided, others have decided that Gaiman is in fact guilty of said allegations. And again, if you haven't already, you guys can help out by liking and sharing the stream, see if we can get some more people to engage. That'd be appreciated. Also, if anything here grabs your attention, feel free to comment and or ask questions, and I'll try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. With that, quote, I feel much more sorry for the fans because for them, those works have a meaning even in the present. But for me, they remain things that I did 30 years ago, and I've long forgotten them, unquote, McKean finally concluded. Dave McKean has been one of the most important artist presences in the path of Neil Gaiman since the beginning. In fact, theirs is one of the longest running and most recognizable collaborations in contemporary comics, lasting over 20 years. It began in 1987 with Violent Cases, the first graphic novel written by Gaiman and illustrated by McKean, which also marked the debut for both in the British publishing scene. In 1988, the two created Black Orchid for DC Comics, a miniseries that helped dictate the tone of the future Vertigo label of the publishing house. That was with Sandman, 1989 to 1996, in parentheses there, that the collaboration reached one of its highest points. McKean created all of the covers in the series, developing a style that mixed collage, painting, and photography, and which defined the visual identity of the magazine, contributing significantly to its success. In the years that followed, Gaiman and McKean worked together several times. Notable titles include Signal to Noise, 1992, Mr. Punch, 1994, and several illustrated books that including The Day I Traded My Father for Two Goldfish, 1997, Coraline, 2002, which of course we know was made into a movie, and The Wolves and the Walls, 2003. Their last collaboration dates back to 2009, the publication of the illustrated book Crazy Hair. So now so of course now now we'll now we will look to Avi's response to what was said there. How ironic Gaiman would pen a title in 1987 about the very subject he was later accused of forcing upon several women he met. As for what McKean says, what's not mentioned is that in the past decade, Gaiman may have shunned McKean because of accusations of Islamophobia made against the latter all over a book he'd illustrated that may have been canceled altogether. However, one looks at this, Gaiman's reaction was entirely unjust, but it's unsurprising that a man of his liberal standings could do that. That said, McKean's cover illustrations for the Sandman series were nothing to write home about. And now, mind you, this is all Avi's opinion, obviously. Avi obviously doesn't think too highly of Gaiman or Gaiman's work or those who work with him. So take that into account anytime you hear some of Avi's commentaries on this. You know, he does quite a bit of editorializing here. And did little to add any kind of appeal to a series that was very depressing in tone. Again, Avi's opinion. And if there's any fault in his statements, it's that he didn't seem to offer his condolences to Gaiman's victims. That's whom should matter far more than the comics or the artwork itself. Interesting, McKean doesn't really care about his past work, but maybe that's because he realizes the stories were overrated. Surely most telling is how the star character, Morpheus, was terminated towards the end of the series, which only suggests Gaiman never really intended for the series to have a long-ranging impact. Now that I think of it, the regular cast of the series rarely appeared outside of it to date. Yet several members of the DCU cast proper, not the least being Hector and Lita Hall, made appearances there, and if Gaiman had special creative control over his books, it begs the query, why does he get to use DCU characters and potentially influence how they go from there? But other writers don't get to make use of his character creations. Not that it matters, because the kind of stories that took place in the Sandman series were so contradicting of what the flagship DCU was meant to stand for. It's better the Sandman cast didn't appear in other comics. Anyways, of course it's a shame, regardless, that so much ink and paper had to be wasted on the writings of an awful as Gaiman turned out to be. Again, opinion. That's an opinion statement. Something this scandal can make clear is that professional artists have to judge their partners carefully, certainly if they want their art and writing to matter as time goes by. It's to be hoped future generations of creators will take that into consideration, certainly when working on creator-owned comics. All right, so there we go with that. Of course, Avi once again put quite a bit of his own opinions on Gaiman and on people who associate with Gaiman into the article there. We see that quite a bit. So, obviously, it's still one of those things where it's a good study in the human psyche and how people come to their conclusions on things, right? So, with that being said, let's get ready to move on. And as I said, if you guys haven't already, you guys can like and share the stream, see if we can get some more friendly people in here to engage. That'd be appreciated. Also, if anything here grabs your attention, feel free to comment and or ask questions. I'll try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. Let me try one more time here to see what we can do. See if we can see if there's not anybody new that we haven't, I think might show some interest. But with that, all right. So now let's get ready to move on to the next story here. Probably the final story we'll look at tonight here. All right, so in here's another Avi story. Did DC Comics truly need Crisis on Infinite Earths to fix its continuity? Article by Avi Green, published May 12th, 2025. Some people would argue yes, because to kind of streamline it and unify it rather than having all these different slices. But let's see what Avi has to say. A writer at Monkeys Fighting Robots speaks about the history of 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC's follow-up to Marvel's Secret Wars the previous year, and what led to the decision to write it up. So if there is one thing that will get fans of superhero comics talking and, in parentheses, most likely arguing, it's a big crossover event. Probably more than any other comic book run, a crossover event will divide a fandom and even entice non-fans to get in on the conversation. Unfortunately, a lot of the dialogue, especially in the internet age, where anyone can post their thoughts online, comes from a negative place, often disparaging the story, criticizing the character representation, and calling the publishers out for the blatant marketing ploy. However, the fact that the quote-unquote event comic exists at all is most likely a marketing ploy mixed with a wider publishing decision, and it is this thought that shapes the event's narrative and characters, not the decades of comics that came before it. The simple reason for this is that the publishers want to change something about the current direction of a particular comic series or even their entire publishing line. I mean, just basically just a reboot of an entire world, maybe, right? Entire narrative. Do you think it was Jonathan Hickman's idea to destroy the Marvel multiverse and restart it? Was Mark Miller badgering the Marvel offices with his magnificent idea of forcing the superheroes to fight against each other? Did Jeff Johns, and Andy Kubert hate the Flash so much that they wanted to run the multiverses to death? No. All of these and most other event stories were born out of a publisher necessity or desire, and it was the creators who had to sell it to the readers. So let's see what Avi has to say in response to what we just read here. The aforementioned writers and artists may not have concocted the stories all by themselves, but they were willing participants in the whole notion. John's quote unquote loved the cast of characters he was scripting is utterly phony, as he's proved since. Let us be clear about something. I don't know about back in the mid 80s, but today crossovers really have become worse than a marketing ploy. They become an act of desperation for short sales boosts that don't last long and have really bored out the audience since. Which I think a lot of people would agree that that's a fair assessment. That's a pretty fair assessment that Avi just gave right there. And the universe-wide crossovers really needed if you want to change or update something about an individual character. Of course not. Oh yeah. And are universe-wide crossovers really needed if you want to change or update something about an individual character? Of course not. not even for a whole group. Well, maybe though it's needed if you wanted to change the entire universe. So maybe not just one character or one group of characters, but maybe just an entire series of characters. When Marvel originally did it, their assigned writers would work in certain details, title by title, not acting like it took the whole crossover to quote unquote erase previously established characteristics and story developments, whether good or bad, as DC did when they followed up Secret Wars with Crisis on Infinite Earths. And unlike when Marvel first produced crossovers up to the turn of the century, some were sadly mediocre, but the saving grace is that, unlike DC, Marvel staff weren't producing all of theirs just for the sake of turning any particular character, select or otherwise, into a sacrificial lamb in the tomb out of some ludicrous notion that only killing certain characters, or worse, turning them into villains, would convince the audience to take them seriously. Hmm. Of course, as some may know, that definitely changed for the worse in 2004 when Marvel turned Scarlet Witch into more of a madwoman for the sake of it than she'd previously been written as in 1990. And in contrast to the Avengers West Coast story, which only lasted several months, the storyline from Avengers Disassembled lasted for at least 8 years. Let us be clear: such storylines, made worse as they were with House of M, um, were completely uncalled for, reek of contempt for the original creators, and were nothing more than cheap ways to shove specific characters to the curb. The same goes for DC's Identity Crisis, of course. I do need to step away from the computer for a moment. I'll be right back, but what I will do is I'll put some music on to entertain you guys while I'm gone. Again, if you guys haven't already, you guys can help out by liking and sharing the stream. See if we can get some more friendly people in here to engage. That'd be appreciated. Also, if anything here grabs your attention, feel free to comment and or ask questions. And I'll try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. So, I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. So let's get back to the article here. And this is now going back to the article that Avi's referencing here. So, but before we start piling all of the blame on the publishers, let's not forget that it was the fans and the creators who grew up reading superhero comics that necessitated the first in-world shakeup event, Crisis on Infinite Earths. The story goes that in 1981, Marv Wolfman received a letter from a fan asking why a character did not recognize Green Lantern in a comic that he had edited, even though the characters had met before. Wolfman did not have an answer, but it did raise the issue of A, why he didn't know, and B, why there was no way for him to check this information. After several decades of ongoing comic titles, continuity was becoming a problem, especially at DC, who hadn't really linked their comics into a shared universe the same way as Marvel. Benjamin Wu has noted that, quote, comics were not only sequestered from the media choices readily available to most people, but also increasingly incomprehensible to anyone uninitiated into the culture of fandom. Now, mind you, too, for those of you who don't understand, part of the reason why Crisis of Infinite Earth happened, what they're getting at here, is that you had characters that had, like for example, you had the DC multiverse. You had two different versions of Superman, two different versions of Batman, two different versions of Wonder Woman. The same characters. So you had two versions of Clark Kent, two versions of Bruce Wayne, two whose lives on each Earth took different courses. Now, some of the other characters. Now, part of that with those three was because their titles continued on running through the portion of through that kind of that portion between the end of the Golden Age and the beginning of the Silver Age. Whereas most of the other characters like the Flash, the Atom, Hawkman, Green Lantern, their characters actually had stopped being published, and they barely came up with new characters. So, but with that being said, of course, one, the situation had occurred because of the changing comic book landscape in North America from the 1950s to the 1980s. Publishing had changed, distribution had changed, and fandom had changed. So now here's Avi's response to all that. Oh, good grief. Doing his Charlie Brown impression. If this really occurred, then pretty strange Wolfman didn't have the courage to just acknowledge he made a mistake or wasn't aware of a certain continuity development. I think something similar happened with the Fantastic Four in the late 70s, early 80s, in regards to whether Sue Storm had seen Dr. Doom's face behind the iron mask. But nobody made a big deal out of the continuity error. That really is that really is petty, especially when you consider what kind of horrors have taken place since the turn of the century in both major superhero universes. Let's see. And no matter what I think of Crisis on Infinite Earths, I'm not buying the whole notion that DC's continuity wasn't linked together as Marvel's was, or that it couldn't have been sorted out individually and self-contained, or that it couldn't have been done without dragging almost every ongoing title into the mess in a way I describe as a wheel hub with spokes. Besides, this item fails to acknowledge that if there was any character title at the time that really suffered post-crisis, it was Green Lantern in more ways than one. I'm just checking the thing because I thought I heard. Oh, right. Heard something outside my door, outside my window. So I had to check that. So that's what I was doing right there. Anyways, let's see. Where were I? Though it actually does acknowledge Marvel originally took a different approach. So back to the article Avi's referencing here. In comparison, Marvel was less obvious with their cleanups than DC. Almost from the beginning, Marvel promoted the shared universe idea and seemed to keep a better in-house record of their history. However, this does not mean they did not make changes, even if a number of these were subtle or relating to only one family of titles. Every time Punisher's origin story was told, small changes would be made to make the story fit the era in which it was published. For example, the Vietnam War became the war in Afghanistan, and then finally an all-encompassing unnamed war. Characters would have their histories rewritten in story so that they could return from the dead or just become more interesting characters. See the Hobgoblin saga in the Spider-Man comics for an example of this, as that character's real identity was revealed several times, each time rewriting the previous reveal. So now, Avi's response to what we just read there. This also alludes to another repellent mistake DC made. Up to a point, they were far more adamant about keeping certain characters in the grave after killing them off, or worse, turn them into criminals in the worst ways possible, as seen with Jean Loring circa Identity Crisis. They did eventually seem to finally back off these status quos in the past several years, but the damage was done, and we're still shaking off the effects, all because DC and Marvel are so utterly desperate to remain relevant, yet vehemently refuse to convincingly deal with the kind of issues that came up post September 11th, 2001. But to say Marvel kept their history tidier definitely doesn't work now, years after Joe Quesada and Bill Jemas oversaw the derailing of continuity, and the above paragraph seems to allude to the post-2000 era, where some of the aforementioned changes were made no longer to any avail. Why, to say a character's history could be rewritten to make them more interesting also falls flat, because that's not exactly the case with Mary Jane Watson in the Sins Past storyline from Spider-Man, any more than it was with Gwen Stacy, and turning MJ into a new variation on Venom doesn't improve the situation either. As seen in the past decade, they certainly weren't trying seriously to make the characters more interesting, so much as they were keeping on with woke publicity stunts, and even before that, the damage was done. Let's see now. From what I can tell, when DC launched comics Crisis on Infinite Earths, okay, so this is still Avi speaking, of course. The whole idea was to merge Earth 1 and Earth 2 into a single universe, even though two or more parallel dimensions could work in retaining a self contained setting for some of the cast, but jettisoning the multiverse is still nothing compared to trashing moral values, as seen since the turn of the century. That's why their so called attempts to streamline their universe eventually fell apart. Funny how they didn't take the same approach at the time with the Legion of Superheroes, simply because they were set several hundred years in the future. Um, but they did eventually take steps that led to eroding what made the Legion work, um, including the elimination of Dawnstar from continuity and retconning Bouncing Boy into a non-powered bit player post Zero Hour. Post Zero Hour. I think it's a shame how these columnists continue sugarcoating the history of crossovers like Crisis on Infinite Earths and Secret Wars without any objective questions asked as to whether crossovers are that necessary to clean up alleged continuity problems. The simple answer is no, they are not. It's entirely possible to retcon simplify these universes without resorting to company-wide crossovers. And if a story is really needed where only so many heroes appear together, it can be done in a self-contained miniseries without mandating every ongoing title be a part of the proceedings. Those points still continue to be ignored by apologists for company-wide crossovers. Well, what I would say to that, though, is depending upon what you want to do, you know, if the whole idea is to streamline a particular universe, one company-wide crossover is enough. The whole idea of basically merging all the universes into one single universe, one single narrative, one single storyline. Yeah, and I think Avi's got a point there. Maybe you do it with a mini series or whatever. You can still have somewhat of a company-wide crossover if the whole idea is to merge merge all of them to where they all coexist into one universe. But regurgitating it time and time again probably it's not something that's necessary. So anyways, let's see. We're up to 43 minutes here now, so let me see here. Oh, I do need to. All right. So with that, now with all that being said and done, now that we're done with that, let's go ahead and take a look back. I'm sorry. Let's go ahead and move on to the wrestling wrap up, as we just simply have WWE news to go over here. First off, we're going to go back, of course, to Friday night SmackDown. Talk about the Go Home SmackDown. Going to go back to Friday Night SmackDown to talk about the Go Home SmackDown heading into Saturday's Backlash. As there were a number of things that helped to set up for. Now, one other piece of WWE news that I will talk about, or wrestling that I'll talk about, of course, with as we talked about yesterday with Sabu's passing yesterday. Many wrestlers today were coming out with their thoughts, including many of his former, friends and associates, and like Rob Van Dam came out and had some things to say. Taz as well. So, just that tidbit. But now, anyways, looking back to Looking back to, of course, last Friday's SmackDown, as it were. The night opened up with Damian Priest and LA Knight defeating Jacob Fatu, Solo Sikoa, and setting up for the four-way match for the Intercontinental title on Saturday at Backlash, as Jacob Fatu would be defending the United States title in a four-way match against LA Knight, Damian Priest, and Drew McIntyre. Only for Drew McIntyre to, of course, attack all four competitors and give a Claymore kick to Jacob Fatu in preparation. Alexa Bliss made her return in the second match as she teamed with Women's United States champions Zelina Vega to take on the Green Regime of Chelsea Green and Piper Niven with Alba Fire in their corner. Then in the number one contenders match, Nia Jax defeated Jade Cargill with some help, getting some help from her sister-in-law Naomi, with the possible hints being dropped at the possible female bloodline being formed with the two of them. But that story will probably develop over time. So now, of course, Nia Jax will in the next few weeks probably get a shot at Tiffany Stratton and look to try to get the title back from her. A non-title tag team match. Fraxium continues their undefeated streak since joining the main roster. They defeated WWE Tag Team Champions, the Street Profits, in 16 minutes 41 seconds. Aleister Black delivered the Black Mass to both Carmelo Hayes and The Miz, as Aleister Black would get the victory and continuing his undefeated streak since his return to WWE. In the main event saw Andrade and Rey Fenix defeat Los Garzas, Angel and Berto, who had, of course, Santos Escobar in their corner, as they continue to build on that story. So, as we continue on with the wrestling wrap up here, so that was all the stuff. Some people felt that this is probably, no Cena, no Orton on the show. They did have some good build for what they did, but some people were still found it a little underwhelming, a bit. So now, with that being said, now let's take a look at Saturday's Backlash, with some things happening at Backlash, of course. Backlash, which, of course, commentary being done by Michael Cole and Wade Barrett, coming from the Enterprise Center in St. Louis, Missouri. Of course, the opening match was the United States Fatal 4-Way match in which Jacob Fatu defending against Damian Priest, Drew McIntyre, and LA Knight. And with the help of Solo Sikoa and new Bloodline member Jeff Cobb making his WWE debut. Jacob Fatu retained the United States title over Damian Priest, Drew McIntyre, and LA Knight, in which McIntyre and Priest, they continue to brawl on the outside. Let me see. But apparently Jacob Fatu was not too happy at not just the interference, but the appearance of Jeff Cobb as well. Lyra Valkyria defeated Becky Lynch to retain the WWE Women's Intercontinental title. Of course, it was also said that Valkyria may have broken her nose in the match, as she was seen having to hold her nose for a moment as it was bleeding out. Hard-hitting match between the two. Some people thought Becky Lynch was going to win, but they felt they wanted to really push Lyra up the card, as it were. Some people are already talking about Lyra possibly being Money in the Bank winner coming up in a month or so. Dominic Mysterio retained the Intercontinental title in his match against Penta. Gunther defeated Pat McAfee. And in kind of what some people call a bit of a bizarre aftermath, Gunther actually showed respect to McAfee. Now, during the match, Michael Cole had left his broadcast position to try to rally behind Pat McAfee. McAfee was, of course, was standing up for himself and Cole. Some people were not overly thrilled with the match, as McAfee, but with a man. And the in the main event, saw John Cena retain the undisputed title over Randy Orton. With John Cena's now appearance dates being down to 24 now. So, but people are speculating that those might be down to single digits by the end of the summer. There were some details revealed as to John Cena's final match, and some people are not happy about it. So apparently it's been revealed that John Cena's final match will probably be at a Saturday Night's Main Event planned in December, where people have been calling for it to be a PLE called Ruthless Aggression, dedicated to him. But because people are not happy because the Saturday Night's Main Event, because NBC and TKO are, of course, trying to milk the fans as much as they can. Trying to milk the fans as much as they can. Which has got a lot of fans upset. To try to get in as many commercials as possible. That's part of the reason why some of these lesser pay-per-views have only 5 matches, because the higher ups at WWE now, the TKO and all that, they want to be just milking it for all it's worth, as they say. So now that's enough of the wrestling wrap up. So now we're gonna with today being Monday, May the 12th, 2025, let's go ahead and take a look back at this day in Niche history. So let's see. Later on 2015, 2021. All right. So we only have a couple pieces of Niche history tonight, So first off, I'm going to go back 10 years ago. And on this date, 10 years ago today, being released digitally, Warner Brothers Animation Batman Unlimited Animal Instincts was released on Blu-ray and digital HD on this date back in 2015, 10 years ago today. It was the first entry in the Batman Unlimited series. So on this date, 10 years ago today in 2015, Batman Unlimited Animal Instincts was released on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD. Of course, let's see. Let's go back. See the The plot sees Gotham City is under attack from a group of animal-related villains who use animal robots to assist them in their crimes. The group, which consists of the Animalitia, consists of Penguin, Cheetah, Man-Bat, Killer Croc, and the leader, a gorilla named Silverback. After foiling various crimes attempted by the group, Batman discovers all the animal crimes form a perfect circle around Gotham City's newest and tallest building, the aviary built by the Penguin. So that's at least the. And of course, some of the names that lent their voices to. Let's see, you got Roger Craig Smith being Batman, Bruce Wayne in this. Dana Snyder voicing Penguin, Oswald Cobblepot. Laura Bailey voicing the Cheetah in this. Barbara Minerva's. John DiMaggio as Waylon Jones, Killer Croc. Will Friedle as Nightwing. Dick Grayson. Yuri Lowenthal, Red Robin, Tim Drake. So a number of different voice actors. So on this date, 10 years ago today, Batman Unlimited Animal Instincts was released on. And finally, on this date, 4 years ago today, back in 2021, the first issue of Image's Time Before Time went on sale on its date back in 2021. Sold for $3.99. It was 40 pages. So Time Before Time from Image Comics went on sale on this date back in 2021. So with that, I thank everybody for being here tonight. I hope everybody enjoyed the show. Of course, we're back here with more Nietzsche News tomorrow. And of course, this Sunday, I'll be joined by the Metal from the Vomitorium, as we'll be looking back at comics that went on sale continuing our look at books that went on sale in May of 1940. We'll be looking at Holyoke this week. So with that, I thank everybody for being here, and I hope to see everybody back here tomorrow. Bye.